Are we good for me to go back to making you co-host?
Yeah, it's live and get set up. Now I've made your host. Okay, you can make me co-host now, Sarah.
Thank you. All right, I think we're good to go. Do
Thank you.
you have any questions before we get started today?
And not now. No questions.
Okay.
Actually. You have already started the recording, so there are no questions.
Okay.
Thanks. Yeah.
Good morning, Lynette. Welcome.
Good morning. Thank you.
How are you?
I'm great. How are you?
Excellent, thank you.
Good.
Do you have any experience with knitting?
I was taught knitting about 7.5 years ago in Florida. And when I moved here, I forgot it.
Okay.
I didn't keep up with it.
Okay. You probably, I'm going to guess, you're going to be surprised at how quickly it comes back to you then if you've already experienced it once before. So
Okay.
should be helpful. Hi, Marlene. Good morning. Welcome everyone as you join in. I'd be curious as you join me to hear what your experience is so far with knitting, if you've never knitted or you Lynette said she's had some experience, but it's been a while since she touched it, so she's looking for a refresher. How about others?
Morning, Sarah. Yeah, this is Marlene. Yeah, I've had a lot of experience with knitting. I just thought I'd come and see, if there's something new that I need to learn, and really exploring a lot of other options of knitting, manipulation of knitting and purling. So I don't know what you're going to discuss today, but just more or less sitting in, listening, and yeah, I'm between intermediate and advanced, but just to see what I can learn.
Okay, you might find. So I have done the work to launch my intermediate crochet class and my intermediate reading crochet patterns class. And I have made the bid to do an intermediate knitting and a reading knitting patterns class. And I've got approval for that. I just don't quite have it developed yet. So once I get the approval, it takes me a little bit of time to videotape everything and whatnot. So Marlene, I hope this isn't too beginner for you. We're going to be covering slip knot, casting on, and knitting stitch today, weaving in ends, that type of thing. So it's really geared towards someone who has never knitted before or really has totally forgotten how. But you're always, you're welcome to be here. And Marlene, you may know some tips that you're going to add to what I'm saying. So, you could be helpful that way. Patricia,
I wouldn't be too sure about that, but yeah.
We'll see. Patricia and is it Valentine or Valentine? Welcome. I'm just kind of curious to know what people are interested in learning today in knitting.
Valentine, thank you.
All right. Valentine, that's a beautiful name. Valentine, what are you hoping to learn today?
Well, I need to refresh in my memory. My mom used to crochet, knit, and make little quilted. She had a quilting frame back in the day, put in the ceiling and quilted. So I just need to refresh in my memory. It's been so long. It's just like I'm starting all over again.
Yeah, I was just having that same conversation with Lynette before you joined us, and I think what you're going to be pleasantly surprised with is how quickly it comes back to you. You'll have to let me know by the end if that's true.
Oh, okay. And I was born on Valentine's Day. That's where I got my name.
So I think that's lovely. So I have a granddaughter due on Sunday, and it's May, and they're going to name her Noelle. And I said,
wow.
honey, I said, she's gonna spend her whole life explaining that she was not born on Christmas.
Oh, wow. Yes, I've had jokes with my name as well. Easter, Christmas, you know.
Yes, I'm sure. All right, I'm gonna go ahead and share my screen and get going because I wanna make sure that everybody feels confident. Just give this a try and have a little bit of confidence as you give it a try. Feel free to follow along if you want to, or if you want to just watch, that's okay too. So, oops, I forgot to hit my present over here. So I want to thank you for joining Get Set Up and me as we learn to knit together. It is really a knitting basics class. I'm so glad you're here. I am Sarah. I'm your guide for today. I live in Everett, Michigan. I spent 22 years in K-12 education. I'm a recently retired elementary principal, and I spent 2 years with Michigan State University working with schools that were struggling academically around the state. That was quite a rewarding part of my career. I live by quotes, and one of my favorites is people do the best they can with what they know, and when they know better, they do better. And what I really like about that quote is it says to me, and the reason I love it so much personally is that I will be learning until the day they put me under the ground. So I love that, the idea that we can learn every day that we're alive if we so choose. And so then when I ran across Get Set Up in my Facebook feed back in January, and I saw that they were reaching out to older adults to teach and learn, I thought, what a great opportunity. And now here I find myself a guide with Get Set Up. So it's quite an opportunity and quite a good partnership for me. We will learn from each other. So I know how to knit. I've knitted since I was very young. I'm not even sure I was a teenager. I might have been a preteen when I learned how to knit. But that does not mean I'm an expert, and it does not mean that I don't still have things to learn. So I may learn some things from you as we go along. I love it when your cameras are on because that allows me to see your expression and whether you're getting it or not. But if you want to keep your camera off, that's okay, I understand. When you get all done, if you say, oh my gosh, if I could just see that one more time, I think I could nail this, know that you can email help@getsetup.io and ask for a copy of the recording. And what I like about the recording is it allows you to queue up to the spot that you want to. You don't have to watch the whole thing. You can just queue it up and watch what you're missing. So just know that what you would do is you would email help@getsetup.io and you'd say, I'd like a copy of Sarah's class from today on Learn to Knit, and they'll send you a copy right through the email. If you're joining by live stream, I'd like to welcome you here with us today, but know that if you would like to be participating with us where I can answer your questions directly and we can communicate with one another, hop on over to the getsetup.io website and sign up for a class that way. I love it when we can communicate with one another. Get Set Up is not paid to promote specific products, nor am I. But as a crafter, you know that I have adopted certain tools of the trade, and I can't help but talk about my favorite brands. So just know that nobody's paying me to do that. I'm just sharing what I love with you. Also online today, we have Victor. Victor is my TA. I like to say that's my teacher and technical assistant. And he's here to help with any technical problems we might have as we go along. He might help me if I miss a chat question. He might help me catch that. Victor, would you like to say hello?
Hi, everyone.
So Victor and I will be trying to monitor the chat box, but you can ask questions. We're a small class today, so you can just unmute yourself if you want to ask a question, or you can type it in the chat box and I'll try to catch it one way or the other. Any questions before we get started? These are the basic things that we're going to cover in our agenda today. We're going to cover basic supplies. We're going to cover how to make a slip knot and how to cast on, how to do a basic knit stitch, or it's also commonly called the garter stitch when you knit every row, how to bind off and how to weave in your ends. Now, as people were coming in, I was kind of doing a little bit of a poll to see what people already know about knitting. Would anybody like to throw out what they're hoping to learn today that maybe hasn't already responded? I like to give people a minute of wait time. Okay, I'll keep going. So these are the basic supplies that you will need to knit. You'll need a pattern, unless you're like my friend Kay, who can say, oh, I want to make a top that fits me, and she can just do it, and she never picks up a pattern. That's not me. That's not how I operate. So you may want a pattern, yarn, knitting needles, scissors, and then some optional items are a yarn or a darning needle, which looks like a great big eye needle. I don't know if you can see that or not, but it's a sewing needle. It's got a very large eye in it that you can use to weave in your end, or you can use a crochet hook. Stitch markers are optional. You won't need them for today. And stitch counters are nice if you're going to do a bigger project, especially. So those are the basic supplies. We're going to go through those supplies a little bit more individually so you know what to do when you pick up a pattern. Needles in and of themselves can be confusing. So there's several different types of needles. There's circular needles, straight needles, and cable needles. So what you see in this large picture is an assortment of circular and straight needles. So these are all straight needles. And what you'll notice about these is that they have stoppers on the end. That stops your work from going off the other end when you're working on it. These are a type of straight needle called a double pointed needle. So you'll notice that on each end of every one of these needles, there's a point. And these are often used for making small circular projects. So for example, my sister-in-law made golf club covers, and they had a very small circumference. And so she used 4 or 5 double pointed needles so that she could make it in a circular pattern. That would be an advanced skill, not one that we're covering today, but you may have run across someone in your lifetime and you go, oh my goodness, how do they do that with all those needles in there? That's what they're doing. They're knitting in a circle. If you still want to work in a circle, but it's a bigger circle, you can use the circular needles. And what you'll notice about this is it's got the points on either end, but it's got this plastic kind of string in the middle. So what's really nice about that is if you've ever knitted in a chair, if your needles are very long, you can actually bump them into the arms of your chair and it's not comfortable. So this allows you to work on a larger project that's straight, like an Afghan, and not, be ramming your elbows into the chair, or it can allow you to do a little bit bigger circular patterns, such as maybe a top that is a tubular top and doesn't have side seams in it. So that's what a circular needle does. These are called cable needles. You would never use cable needles alone. You would always use them in conjunction with one of these other types of needles. But what these do is they allow you to hold stitches and pull them either forward or back to make that cable pattern down the middle. Oftentimes you'll see it down the middle of a sweater or a vest. And it's simply where it looks like the stitches are twisted or spiraled up the design, and it takes a cable needle to get that done. The needles also, if you go into the store, oftentimes they have the sizes marked somewhere on them, maybe on the end, maybe on the shaft of the needle itself, and oftentimes on the package. And they range in a variety of sizes. For today, I've asked you to, if you wanted to follow along, if you have size 8 needles, these are my size 8 needles. They're about a foot long, I would say, and they're just 2 straight needles with the stoppers. And on the end, it tells me that it was made by Boy. They're size 8, which is also equal to, let me see, 5.0 millimeters. And so that's how you can tell what size. Or some of my needles, like this one, is a small set of circular needles, and they're wooden, which is my favorite, by the way. These were probably the needles that I started knitting on 40 years ago, or 50 years ago now. But this is a wooden circular needle. I really love the feel of the wood in my hands. It tells me the sizes, and I know you can't see that, but the sizes are engraved right on the side of the needle. So these are size 7s, 4.5 millimeters. And then this is a set of circular needles that I have, that are very large that I used to make a very large Afghan for my daughter recently. So that's just a little bit about needles. Any questions on needles before I go on to the yarn? All right. Next, we're going to talk about how to read a yarn label. And this is important if you've ever been in like a Joann's or a Hobby Lobby or a Michael's. You may have noticed, I know when I was young and I walked into a store, there was one aisle that maybe had some yarn in it. And it usually was, there were three choices usually. There was acrylic yarn in a skein, which would have looked similar to this. There was cotton yarn for making like a dishcloth, which was in a skein that looked like this. And then there was cotton thread used for crocheting or knitting with little teeny needles. Now, when you walk in a store, there can be literally aisles and aisles of yarn. So knowing how to understand the label is an important skill that you're going to want to understand. So the label tells us all kinds of things about the yarn. It tells us, first of all, the weight of the yarn. And what I've asked you, if you're going to follow along today, to use is a size 4 cotton yarn. Acrylic will work, although I don't love acrylic for a dishcloth. I do love the cotton for a dishcloth, but acrylic will work. That 4 is telling us basically how big around one of these strands is. And if I understand correctly from my research, that 4 came from this being called 4-ply yarn. It used to be just called 4-ply yarn. That's because there's 4 strands twisted together to make one strand. But that 4 no longer, because there's so many sizes of yarns now, that 4 no longer designates the number of strands. It just tells us that this is the weight of this particular yarn. So average is 4. I've seen sizes that range from 1 to 9 in the size of the strand. So you can imagine very, very thin, like sock yarn or lace yarn, all the way up to very, very bulky, which you can use to make blankets, which might be a 9, and that's usually called super bulky. Another thing that this tells us is how much yarn in weight is in this skein. So in this case, it's 7 ounces or 200 grams. And if you're in the UK, that gram becomes a lot more important. Why I need to know that is because if I pick up a pattern for a top and it says I need 9 ounces, I know that one skein is not going to be enough to make that sweater. So I'm going to purchase 2 of these. And my goal is always, when I purchase, to purchase enough to finish a project, even if that means I keep a skein. I have a skein extra that I can return to the store later. And as long as I keep the skein clean and protected, so for example, in the bag that I bought it in, I've never had a store refuse to take it back if I've over purchased, as long as I don't wait too long to do so. The other thing that this is telling us is the length of this yarn. In other words, this is one really long strand of yarn. In fact, it's 415 yards long, or 380 meters. Sometimes when you look at a pattern, it says you need X number of ounces. Sometimes when you look at a pattern, it says you need X number of yards. And sometimes when you look at a pattern, it will tell you both. But you need to be able to know how to find it on the label so that you can purchase enough yarn to do so. The other thing is with yarn, and it used to be only this way, yarn came in a dye lot, and it would have the dye lot number right on the label. And what would happen is if the dye lots were numbered, and you always wanted to pick out, if it needed 4 skeins, you'd want to make sure you had 4 skeins with the same dye lot number on it, because the shades varied from one dye lot to the next. And so this actually happened to me recently, where my daughter bought a large amount of bulky, super bulky yarn for me to make her an Afghan. And we did our best guess. I didn't have a pattern that told me how much I needed. We did our best guess, and lo and behold, I ran out. And I ordered some more online. It looked like it was going to be exactly the same, and it was a shade off. And I think she ended up gifting the Afghan to someone else because it drove her so crazy that she could see the difference in the shades. So that's that. And sometimes you look on it, because it also might say no dye lot. And when it says no dye lot, that means you can go back and back and back and back, and you should never see a variation in the shades. The skein is also going to give you laundering instructions. It has all these neat little icons on it, but it also tells you in words usually underneath what that means. If you don't know, over here shows you a key to the laundering, but you don't have to memorize that because it does usually say it in writing underneath. And then finally, we've got our gauging information, and I'm actually going to switch to the next slide and show you a close-up of the gauging information. So today's project that I'm going to show you today is how to make a garter stitch. Garter stitch is where you knit every row. And it's a dishcloth. So I didn't really care if it ended up being 6 inches square or 16 inches square. 16 might be an exaggeration, but you get the point because it's a dishcloth. But if I was making a top to wear, all of a sudden the gauge makes a difference. So what this is telling you is if you've got this yarn in a 4 and you use size 9 needles, which are 5.5 millimeters around, and you cast on 16 stitches and you knit for 22 rows, you should have a 4x4 square. So let's say that you do that and you swatch it out like I did, which is, different than the size of my washcloth, right? This is my swatch. If I do that and it ends up bigger than 4x4, that means I knit loose and I may want to go down a needle size. Or if I get done and it's much, much smaller than 4x4, I may want to go up a needle size so that I make sure that I'm matching. And I'll tell you, I was making an American Girl outfit for one of my granddaughters, and I knitted it, and it was a fairly lengthy project to make. It wasn't just a one evening thing. And I got all done and I gave it to her and it fell right off the dowel. So it was discouraging to me to spend all that time, where if I'd have just stopped and swatched before I got started, that would not have happened. So what questions might you have about the yarn, choosing the yarn at this point? Oh, I forgot. I'm sorry. I'm going to go back one slide and tell you one more thing that's on here, and that's the fiber content. The fiber content is also on the skein, and this one says that it's 90% acrylic and 10% alpaca wool. Why you might need to know that especially is, well, first of all, if you want to make something that's cotton and breathable, you're not going to want to use acrylic, and vice versa. If you want some warmth, you may not want to use cotton. You may want to use an acrylic or a wool. So you want to know your fiber contents. There are lots and lots of variations of this. I just finished for my advanced crochet class using this bamboo yarn. And so it's partially acrylic and partially bamboo, and it is absolutely fabulous. But it ended up a little bit different. So knowing the fiber content is also important. Also, if you get 100% wool, if you happen to pick up one that's 100% wool and untreated, you could end up washing it the first time and making a sweater for your husband and ending up with it fitting your dog. So you want to always know what your fiber contents are. Any questions? What questions might you have at this point on the yarn or the needles?
Sarah, will the pattern tell you what the if it's acrylic or cotton or whatever, will the pattern tell you what to choose?
Yes. Oftentimes the pattern tells you. What is frustrating sometimes, however, Lynette, is that I have found that I'll pick up a pattern and somebody makes it with their favorite yarn, and I've actually picked up a pattern and I've Googled the yarn trying to purchase it, and it's not even made anymore. So that's where understanding. I've actually had to go so far as to go in and say, this is not the case. Lion Brand makes lots of yarn. So let's just say, I go in and I say, what size is Lion Brand? I'm not thinking of, their cotton crochet thread. Let's just say, what size is that? And I find out whether it has that 4 on it or not, because then I can buy another yarn that has a 4 on it and know I'm going to get similar results.
Okay.
So it does usually tell what the fiber is though. Even if it's their favorite thing, they'll usually say the fiber in the pattern. Patterns have
Okay.
lots and lots of great information. That's a great
Okay.
question. What other
Thank
questions?
you.
Yep. What other questions might there be on yarn or needles? Okay, so if you wanted to follow along today, I used a cotton knitting yarn. This was the one that I used, and you'll see that again in the video. It's a medium weight. It's called medium weight, or it's also called a 4. Sometimes it used to be called worsted weight. It used to be called 4-ply when it was in the 4. I used those straight knitting needles, size 8, and I used a pair of scissors, and that was all I used. So feel free to follow along. I'll send you a copy of the pattern when we get all done. And remember, you can get a copy of the video by emailing help@getsetupdiet.io and asking for a copy of this video. So this is the pattern that I'm using today. And I did it, I actually created this pattern to make it very basic on purpose. So it's cast on 36 stitches, which is abbreviated in a pattern, CO 36 STS. I am in the process of creating a pattern reading class because it's a little bit like breaking a code. So in this case, it's cast on 36 stitches, knit every row for 48 rows or until it's square, which would be abbreviated K, every row for 48 rows or until square. And literally what I did was when I got to the point where I thought it was square, I folded it from corner to corner while it was still on my needle. And I said, yep, it's square enough. And that's when I bound it off. That was okay to do because I was making a dishcloth. If I was making clothing, it would tell me exactly how many rows to make. And I could say 48 rows, but you may knit looser than I do or tighter. And 48 rows might not have yours exactly square. So just do it until you're satisfied. Then you're going to bind off 36 stitches and you're going to tie off and weave in your ends. And when you knit every row, that is called the garter stitch. All right, so this is a quick video on how to start the yarn out of the center of the ball. There are skeins. So this is a skein of cotton crochet yarn, knitting yarn, different than an elongated skein. This one's more elongated, this one's a little more squat, but they work pretty much the same way. Think of this as one really long piece of thread that's wound around. So there's the outside end, and there's the inside end. The outside end is not a good one to pull from because there's no smooth way to unravel it without rolling the skein all around. So my favorite way is, I'm going to show you right here, that's that you kind of poke into the center. You keep poking until you get as close to the center of the skein as you possibly can.
Sarah, can you increase the volume? Actually, Denise is unable to hear.
Okay, I'm going to pause it for just a second. Someone is unable to hear. Is anyone hearing what I'm saying?
It's the volume of video she's asking, I think.
I can
Denise.
hear you.
You can hear it okay? All right, I'm going to keep going.
It was very low.
It's low?
Yeah,
Yes.
you're okay, but what you're trying to show us is low.
Okay.
There's my thread end. And so this is where I want to pull from. Once I use this little extra that I pulled out, it will pull freely from the skein without the skein ever moving.
Are there any questions on pulling it from the middle? So I'll just real quick recap it. So literally, I literally reached my fingers into the very center and I really try to get to that center point so that I'm not pulling out more than necessary, but it keeps the skein from rolling around as you're pulling. It keeps you from having to ball the yarn up. It keeps the yarn cleaner because it's not rolling around. So there's a lot of advantages, and it knots less easily when you're pulling from the center. So there's a lot of good reasons to do it that way. Any questions on that? All right, tell me if the volume for this video is any better. So this is how to make the slip knot.
So for today's knitting lesson, I've selected a tail.
That's the same. It's very low.
Sorry, I don't know how to make it any louder.
It's about 2 feet long. 18 inches in size.
I can hear it much better than before. I can hear it good now.
Okay, good.
This one
I can't.
and size 8 needles.
Sarah, can you check your audio settings? You can go to the mute button where you can find your auto settings, and then you can check you can test the speaker.
Can I do it on this screen, Victor, or on the other screen?
The Zoom screen of yours, where you will find the mute button.
Right here?
Yeah, you can click onto it and then you'll find your audio settings.
You're on 100%.
Okay.
Yeah. So I wonder, I hear some people saying that they're able to hear it really well and others saying that they can't. So I wonder if you've got your volumes all the way up as high as it can go. And that's the best I can do. So sorry. Okay.
Like this. And go around with my fingers, making a loop. Like this. And I take that loop off my fingers and I push the tail through from behind, making a loop. And then I gently go and tug it on the tug until I've got a slip knot. It's like that. And I simply slip that slip knot onto my needles. Now I've got my 2-foot tail left along with my working thread, which is going to my skein of yarn. And I tighten my slip knot down so that I'm ready to begin casting on stitches.
So somebody said, how big of a tail do you leave? Is there any kind of rule of thumb? And I didn't know the answer to that. And I Googled it afterwards and this is what I found. They said, if you go 4 times the width in inches, so if something's going to end up 10 inches wide, so this one's probably about 6 or 7 inches wide, but if it was 10 inches wide, you would need 40 inches of yarn. So if this is 7 inches wide, I would need 7 times 4, which would be 28 inches. That makes a lot of sense to me as long as you're using an average size needle. But if you were using a very large needle, you might want to increase that. And if you were using a very small needle, you might have more left over. But what I do know is I always err on the side of too much rather than too little, because I hate it if I'm doing a bigger project and I get to the very end and I'm missing enough to cast on, say, 10 stitches. So that tail is important. Now there are other types of casting on. The reason I use this one is I suspect, because I'm using 2 strands of yarn as I do it, that it's making a stronger base. There is a single strand cast on that I have done before, but it does not look nearly as secure to me, and I suspect it wouldn't pass the test of time like the double strand method.
Sarah, we have a question from Judy. Any special tips for left-handed people?
So that's a great question. Any special tips for left-handed people? My answer to that is I am not left-handed. I'm right-handed, but I do know that my niece, who is left-handed, learned to both knit and crochet by watching her mother from the opposite side. So she sat, instead of sitting next to her, she sat across from her. And that was how she was able to do it. I don't know if that's helpful at all. I am, and is there anybody on here who's a knitter who is left-handed that might have a tip? Okay, no left-handed knitters this time. So yeah, so that's all I know about left-hand knitting is how my niece actually picked it up herself. So here's casting on.
Now there's really 2 parts to think about when you're casting on stitches. The first first is how you hold the knitting needle, and the second is how you hold the thread itself. So I hold, when I'm casting on, I hold my knitting needle like this. In other words, I'm not holding it like a pencil. I'm holding it more like I would hold a knife or something that I was going to.
Linda, thank you for that tip. Her tip is for left-handed people, watch the instructor through a mirror. I was talking to my husband about this problem the other day because somebody asked about left-handedness, and he wondered if that would work. So it's nice to see that as a tip.
Slice or cut. So, and then I put my pointer finger on that slip knot that we've already put on the needle. So this is what I'm doing with the needle. And then I take the thread, which is now 2 strands, and I grasp that thread with my lower 3 fingers, and I divide the 2 strands between my pointer finger and my thumb. So if I'm looking at it from this direction, it looks like this, but I'd like to turn it sideways so that you can see. I almost think of it as a diamond, where this is the top of the diamond, these are the 2 sides, and down here I'm holding on to the bottom of that diamond. And this is what you need to do to cast on. It's a little bit tricky, so stick with me. So I'm going to pull my thumb up into the left, exposing the thread here, and I'm going to take my needle and I'm going to go underneath. And actually, if you can kind of see it, it's like it's a loop on my thumb. So I'm going underneath that spot or through that loop, and I'm picking up the tail thread that's back here, and I'm bringing it back through the loop, and then I tighten it down, just like I did the slip knot. So there's 2. So let me do it again. Grab all of those 2 threads with my bottom 3 fingers. And then with my pointer and my thumb, I separate those 2 threads, making a diamond shape. Then I bring my knitting needle all the way to the front while I bring my left thumb up to the left. And I go through the thread, wrapping this back thread or the tail around it from the top to the bottom, and then I come back through the loop, tighten it down. One more time. Grab it with my fingers, separate the 2 threads between my forefinger and my thumb. While I'm pulling my thumb up to the left, I'm bringing my yarn down underneath, going through the loop that's on my thumb, going over the top of the thread that's on my forefinger, and bringing that back through the loop that's on my thumb, and tightening that down. There's 4, so I'm going to do it a little bit faster. Thumb up, through, wrap, through, pull. Do it again. Through the thumb from underneath, wrap from the top to the back, through, and off. Again, through, wrap, through, again, through, wrap, through, and pull. Now, what I'd like you to notice about the few that I put on here so far is I'm trying to keep my loops that are on my needle fairly evenly distributed and with an even amount of tension on them. And that makes it easier and more neat when you actually want to start knitting. The other thing that's important about this part right here is that you not do it too tightly, or A, it's going to be difficult to knit your first row, and B, it can actually pull your work in unevenly. So you want this to be a little bit of a looser tension than you might do for your actual knitting.
Any questions on casting on?
So can we do the slip knot again? Because I can't practice this without doing the slip knot.
Yeah, let me go back real quick. Let me see if I can get back there without a lot of trouble here. Okay, here's the slip knot. I'm gonna go for it.
So I'm gonna cast on about 18 inches on the size 8 pair of needles, and size 8 needles. I'm gonna start with a slip knot. Slip knot. I do like this. I go around it.
All right, I'm gonna stop it right there. Can you see how it's really just a loop around my fingers? Are you able to see that?
Yes.
Okay, now watch what I do with the loop.
My fingers making a loop like this. And then I take that loop off my fingers and I push the tail through from behind, making a loop. And then I gently kind of pull and tug until I got a slip knot. It's like that. And I simply slip that slip knot onto my needles. And now I've got
So on the slip knot for just a minute, if you really can't master the slip knot, don't let that hold you back. You can just make a little loop and tie a knot at the base of the loop, or tie a knot, you know, like wrap your yarn around your needle and tie a knot under here. I love the slip knot because it's so easy to use, but it shouldn't be a showstopper for you. The other thing is I cannot stress enough how important it is to do that first row a little bit loose. A tip if you're an advanced knitter, I don't want to scare anybody, but one thing that you can do if you want to keep it loose is you can cast on over 2 needles at the same time. So you pretend the 2 needles are 1 needle and you cast on over the 2, and then when you get done, you just pull 1 out. And what it does is it keeps your tension even, but it makes it nice and loose. So that's just a tip. I don't want anybody don't feel like you have to do that because it's a little bit of an advanced skill, but I know there's a few people on here that might be a helpful tip. All right, other questions before I hit the how to knit button? All right, here we go. I'm going to skip ahead just a tad.
This is 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18. Now, remember, I was working with
I did 18 because I was swatching. This is for my swatch, not for my dishcloth. So don't get confused about why I'm putting 18 stitches on for a 35 stitch dishcloth. Okay, this is just my swatch.
But to actually begin knitting, I'm going to turn the needle and I'm going to put it in my left hand. And I'm going to scooch my stitches up kind of close to the tip, but not all the way to the tip. And also notice I do still have a bit of the tail left, about probably close to 10 inches there. That's okay, I can always turn it off real quick. And I'd rather have more than less, by the way. And so I'm going to begin knitting now. And I'm going to show you that how I hold my needle in my left hand is the same way I held the cast on needle in my right hand before. So I've got it held in this kind of knife way. And I've got my first stitch just probably 1/4 of an inch back from where it starts to taper right here. And I'm really counting on these 3 fingers to do the bulk of the work in what I begin doing. So this is the fold that I'm going to be using. And what you would do with the right is again hold it in that same hold, the right needle. And I'm going to go into this first stitch from the left side of the stitch through the center of that stitch to the back. And then kind of, you can see I totally removed my right hand. Now I'm holding everything with my left hand. And I'm going to pick up, and I'm going to make sure that I'm picking up the yarn that is attached to the skein, the working yarn, and not the tail. And I've made that mistake many times. And I'm going to, using the working thread, I'm going to wrap from behind in a counterclockwise position. I'm going to bring it down through or between those 2 stitches And I'm gonna hold it like this while I work that stitch through and off the needle. Now I can see right there that my thread split and I don't like that. So I'm gonna do that stitch over again. I'm gonna cast that back on. Don't like those split stitches at all. And I'm gonna go through from the left toward the right. I'm gonna make sure I've got my working thread. I'm gonna go around the needle counterclockwise through between those two pulls, not between those two needles. And then I'm gonna bring this back needle to the front. And I'm gonna scooch the stitch off, just slide it off to the right, and there's my first knitted stitch. Okay, so now I'm gonna scooch it up a little bit closer to the needle. I'm gonna go in from the left to the right, and from the front to the back. I'm gonna wrap the yarn counterclockwise, pulling it snugly between the two needles, kind of holding that thread with my right hand, and you can see where I was my pointer finger. I'm assisting the needle back through, pulling the loop from the back to the front, and then pulling the old stitch off by pushing to the right. So through from left to right, front to back, wrap and pull that thread through, push the old stitch off. So let's do it again. Okay, so through, wrap counterclockwise, pull that thread through, push the old one off. So through, wrap, through, off, through, wrap, through, off, through, wrap, through, off. All right, I'm going to be quiet for the through, wrap, through, off. Now you do it. Through, wrap, through, off, through, wrap, through, off, through, wrap, through, off, wrap, through, off. And I've almost got my 18 stitches knitted. And my last one.
Okay, any questions on how to knit? So the next thing we're going to do is just turn it around and go the opposite direction for row 2.
Now here is the end of the first row of knitted stitches, and I've taken the, remember when I finished, I moved all of these stitches over onto the right hand needle, and I'm taking my right hand needle, I'm turning it around and I'm going this way, putting it in my left hand so that I can knit row 2. There's a couple things that I'd really like to show you about this row before we get started. First is to make sure that you count, especially in the beginning, and make sure you still have the same number of stitches you started with. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18. Yep, I got it. Now, very important part before you start your second row is to make sure you pick that up. Now, I'm going to scooch my stitches up toward the taper. And I'm going to get ready to knit, but I'm going to make sure that my working yarn is straight down into the back. And let me show you why. If you don't make sure that it's straight down into the back, you can, and you go over the top, look how all of a sudden it looks like I've got 2 stitches to knit instead of 1. So I'm going to pull these other stitches back and watch how those 2 stitches disappear when this thread is in the right place. So you always want to make sure your thread is down into the back when you get started on your second row. And then we're going to be doing a garter stitch today. And what the garter stitches is simply knit every row. And you can see, we counted those stitches that were on the needle, but you can see that we've got these bumps. And these bumps tell us that the previous row was knitted when we're looking at this side. So now we're going to knit two, and we're going to do that the same way. We're going to go through the loop from left to right, front to back, secure it with our left hand. We're going to pick up that working thread. We're going to go counterclockwise through, kind of holding on with our right hand and assisting with our left. We're going to pull it through. Oh, look, I've got that split stitch again, and I recognize it early. So I'm going to pull it out, and I'm going to do it again. So back, front to back.
Pulling it out like I just did, because I saw that I split the thread, only works if I haven't moved the needle, moved that stitch off the needle. If I just suddenly decided to rip that and it was on the right needle, I might actually lose stitches. So just be conscious of that when you're working on that. Are there any questions about starting row 2? I've literally seen, especially I've taught a lot of young girls how to knit, anywhere from ages 6 to 20. I've had classes on knitting. And what the reason I know about that stitch over the needle at the beginning is because their work would go like this. And pretty soon something that was supposed to be, 15 stitches wide was 30 stitches wide. And it was just that they were adding a stitch every row by not starting with that thread in the right position. So it is important. Questions? I'm not going to play this video, but I'm going to show you right here on this work how to count. So the garter stitch has, can you see how there's like a top bump and a bottom bump? That's 2 rows. So I would know that we've got 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, because there's 2 rows of bumps. And that's always how you count a garter stitch. So there's a lower bump and an upper bump. Those 2 bumps together make a pair of rows. So 2, 4, 6, 8, 10. Also, I could do tally marks, right, on a piece of paper, or I could use a stitch marker. On a small project, that's not as important, but the bigger the project is, the more you want to track both your stitches and your rows, because it can make a huge difference. Okay, here's binding off. This is, what do you do when you get done? How do you finish it off?
For this swatch that I'm making for this demonstration, the swatch is 18 stitches wide by 24 rows long. And I've got my working needle in my left hand, and I'm going to bind off, holding pretty much everything the same. And I'm going to be knitting. There's one difference. So I'm going to knit the first stitch just the same as I've knitted everything else. I'm going to go from the left to the right and from the front to the back, wrap counterclockwise, pull it through, push the yarn off, and then I'm going to knit the second stitch. So I've got 1, now I'm going to do 2. And after I get those 2 done, I'm going to bring my left needle over, pick up that first stitch, and drag it over the top of that second stitch, pulling that first stitch off. And then I'm going to knit the second stitch.
Which is really the third stitch.
So knitting the second stitch. Now I've got 2 stitches on the right hand needle. I'm going to pick up the first stitch, going from left to right. And I'm just going to pull it over. See if you can see that. Pull it over the second stitch and off the needle. Okay, so I'm going to knit the next stitch. Got 2 back over on that right hand side again. I'm going to pick up this one. I'm going to drag it over the top of that one and pull it off. Okay, so now I'm going to keep doing that 1 stitch at a time. Knit 1, bind 1 off. excuse me, I'll pull some yarn here. I'm gonna knit one. Oops, got a split thread. There we go. Knit one. Knit one. And bind one off.
Okay, now this one, the next video is getting to the very end of the row.
Okay, down to my last bind off stitch here. I've got just one stitch, working stitch over here, and I've got the last stitch that needs to be bound off over here. I'm going to knit that last stitch. Now I've got nothing left on this needle, but I still need to take this one and pull it over the top of that one. And then what I do is I take this needle and I kind of tug it so there's a bigger loop. I cut my yarn and I just put that yarn back through that loop. And I tighten it down, securing my knitting. And then if you look up here at this top edge where I just did my binding knot, I've got a nice even kind of V-stitched edge on there that's pleasant to look at.
And then last but not least, we have to weave in our ends.
One of the final bulges cut off, and so if I came in here with my scissors and I cut this off right here, with nothing more secure than that last little loop that I made, this could very easily come unraveled and all my work would be lost. So you can do this with a couple different ways. And for this video, I'm going to demonstrate using my yarn needles. This is my preferred way of weaving in my ends. I could use a crochet hook to do it.
I'm going to skip ahead just a tad.
So I just take my tail of my, where I cut it off, and I put it through that needle. And then I decide where's my front and where's my back. I'm going to actually flip this over. And you just take this and you just wind it through. And what I tend to do is I tend to go up, down, up, and down. And I go through a minimum of 5, maybe more stitches. And then I stretch it a little bit. And then trim it off. And now I've got a much more secure end to my project.
Oops. Okay, it is 12:27 in my time zone, which means we have 3 minutes left. So I'm not going to go over the reading and the knitting pattern piece. However, do know that I have been given approval to develop this class, and I'm hoping to be able to launch one that is just on reading, knitting, and also a reading crocheting class. What questions do you have at this point?
Those last set of needles that you used, what was it called? The one with the big eye?
Oh, it's called a steel yarn needle. It might also be called a tapestry needle. It just literally is a big, and they make them in plastic too. It's just literally a big needle with a big eye on it, and it works really well.
Okay, thank you.
Yep. What other questions might you have? These are some samples of some things that I've knitted. This is the pattern. I don't have the Afghan anymore because I gave it as a gift, but that was quite a complicated one. This is that cable stitching using the small needle. This is a garter stitched sweater for this doll, and a garter stitched headband. So that's something that you could, it's a relatively easy beginner project. This is using that size 9. I think that's that size 9 yarn. It's huge. My son asked me to make that for him, and it fits a bed. That was using, the needles for this were so big that he made them for me. He made me a set of knitting needles in his shop. This is a cable Afghan that I made, baby Afghan. These are slippers that I make out of 100% wool yarn and then shrink them to fit feet. I've made something like 50 pairs of these or more, because what happens is I make them and I give them as gifts for all of my children and their spouses and now my grandchildren. They come back and they ask for more because they end up being their favorite slippers. And this is that, using those big circular needles that I showed you, using variegated yarn. I will never make variegated yarn if I want use variegated yarn if I want the beauty of the pattern to show through. I should have used a solid color, and then you could see all the beautiful stitches in there. It got lost in the variegated yarn. Here's some resources for you. There's lots of mystery knit-alongs that you can find online now. This is one that was published back, actually it was published in December. I thought it was current and I signed up for it. You can still sign up for it, but it's really not even active anymore. So that was a little bit of a bummer. But know that there are online knitting circles that you can join that are a lot of fun. What questions might you have? Did anybody get it? Were you able to follow, and was anybody able to follow along and actually knit?
No, because after
off. Lynette, what you got?
After I got behind with the slip knot, I wasn't able to follow on with the casting on, but I'll go back and look at it, and it should be able to refresh my memory with it.
Yeah, just remember at that help@getsetup.io, you can get a copy of it. And you know, there's YouTube videos out there on it too. Sometimes you just need to be able to talk it through with someone. So I'm going to stop the share, I think. Yep, there we go. All right.
Thank you so much, Sarah.
Today, and I hope to see you again. Linda, you showed
Okay.
me one the other day, didn't you? Linda, was it crocheting you joined me for?
Yes, I did. I wanted to.
Oh.
Yes, I popped into your crochet class and I wanted to see how somebody taught how to do it. And I learned something today. Your casting on method was different than I had been taught previously. And so I appreciated your explanation, and your video helped me figure it out, because another YouTube video online used that method and I just couldn't get it figured out. So yours really helped. The like loop it around your fingers and then rotate your thumb up. That was the part that was missing. So your explanation really helped.
Good, I'm glad.
And I'd love to learn to knit some things. So far, I learned to knit rectangles and squares. And so I make baby blankets, but there are other things out there in the world that I would love to learn how to get some instruction on.
So you may want to join when where we do the intermediate class. You might be just ready for that.
And I liked watching your crocheting, because I learned to crochet as a child out of the World Book Encyclopedia.
Oh, now, my goodness.
That dates me, but
that's awesome. But
I was like 8 years old and was looking at the pictures in the World Book to teach myself to crochet.
That's awesome.
So I appreciate human instruction. It really helps.
Good. All right. Best of luck to all of you as you get started. Thanks for joining me.
Thank you, Sarah.
Thank you, Sarah.